In this video, we're going to talk about 8 great modern migrations. These are going to be migrations that have involved huge amounts of people, millions of people, and they've completely changed the face of humanity. The first great migration we're going to talk about, we'll call it from Europe to North America. Right? This is a mass migration of people coming from Europe, coming to North America. Europeans first came to North America starting with the colonial period all the way up through the early 1900s. Many migrated voluntarily, while others were more reluctant migrants who were escaping harsh economic conditions and religious persecution. For example, on my dad's side of the family, my great-grandfather came to the U.S. from Austria at the end of the 1800s. He migrated to New York as part of a large-scale emigration caused by terrible economic conditions and poverty in the part of Europe he came from. 90% of European immigrants were British up until about the mid-1800s. Today, though, most Americans of European descent are actually of German ancestry. And then Italian, British, Irish, Russian, and Soviet ancestry is just behind that. We can see that on this map here. Many of you already know the story of Native Americans rather well, so I'm not going to tell you any other stories to help you remember this migration. This should be an easy mass migration to remember. Migration number 2, we're going to call it Iberia to Central and South America. So from Iberia, and when we talk about Iberia, we mean the Iberian Peninsula, where you have Portugal and Spain. So mass migration number 2 is from Iberia to Central and South America. So again, from Spain and Portugal basically, or what we call the Iberian Peninsula. And from that place, we have had hundreds of thousands of Europeans that emigrated to Central and South America. This is why Brazilians speak Portuguese today. This is why most South and Central Americans speak Spanish today. People of European ancestry are a majority today of the population in many countries, and they're a minority in others. So for example, Argentina, 97% of the population of Argentina claim to be of European ancestry. Almost all Argentinians are of European descent. In Uruguay, 90%. Brazil, 50%. Chile, 25%. Paraguay, 20%. Venezuela and Colombia, also 20%. Ecuador, 15%. Bolivia, Peru, also a significant portion of the population that claims to be of European descent. An easy way to remember this mass migration is just to remember Christopher Columbus. The first European contact with South Americans occurred in 1498 with the arrival of Columbus's third expedition, and it continued with following explorations to Peru, Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere in the 1500s. The Spanish gained control of the western third of the continent, the Portuguese of the northeast coastal region, and what is now eastern Brazil. European influences are still a major factor in modern-day South American culture. We already talked about Spanish being the national language in most of these countries, and Roman Catholicism remains the dominant religion in these places as well. And more than that, the political boundaries of these nations have largely been determined by their former Spanish and Portuguese colonizers. All right, the next mass modern migration, we'll call it number 3 here. It's from the British Isles to the British Empire. So we're talking about a mass migration of people coming from the British Isles to all the places that made up the British Empire. The British go to Australia, they go to New Zealand, they go to Africa, and we're talking millions of people as part of this mass migration. And we know it today because the people in these places, they're speaking English, they're practicing Christianity. In Australia and New Zealand, we see the same thing that we did with the British in North America. There's going to be fights with the natives. There's going to be taking away of native lands and then settling in and giving everything English names before finally coming to some sort of terms with the natives. In Australia, the natives were the Aborigines. In New Zealand, they were the Maori. Australia, interestingly enough, was originally treated as a penal colony by the British. When we say a penal colony, we're talking about basically a prison colony. From the late 1700s to the mid 1800s, over 100,000 prisoners were sent to Sydney, Australia, and Tasmania, which is that island off the coast there. From 1838 onwards, migration in Australia was pretty much stimulated by financial subsidies from the British government, and at least 3 million people went to Australia and New Zealand over that next century. There was even a gold rush in Australia in the mid 1800s that helped to attract another 500,000 immigrants. All right, other than Australia and New Zealand, the British also go to Africa during this time period. They're going to places like Kenya, to Nigeria, to the country that today is South Africa. And they're going to use slave labor there to generate capital through plantations of coffee, which is indigenous to Africa, plantations of tea, and plantations of tobacco. Moving on, mass migration number 4. From West Africa and Angola to the Caribbean, coastal Brazil, and the American South. Again, mass migration number 4 is from West Africa and Angola to the Caribbean, the coastal Brazil, and the American South. So the Americas were the destination of another mass migration of immigrants, in this case, African slaves. Although this migration is mapped as just one of the other 8 major migrations, the impact it had on people on both sides of the Atlantic really sets it apart from all the other ones. I mean, when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade, we're talking about the forced relocation of nearly 12 million people. Contrary to popular belief, only about 5% of the slaves from the African slave trade actually went to the United States. Most slaves went to the Caribbean. And think about it. Do any Caribbean nations have a substantial black population today? Think about Jamaica, Haiti, absolutely, right? Most British slaves went to the Caribbean islands. Most Portuguese slaves went to Brazil. The British and other European powers, they usually obtained slaves from a narrow strip of land along the west coast of Africa, extending from Liberia in the north there, down to Nigeria, and all the way down through Angola. And the pattern of trade that followed became known as the triangular trade system. Ships from Europe would bring cloth, tobacco, iron, guns, all sorts of other goods down to Africa to be traded for slaves and gold. Those same ships are going to transport slaves from Africa to the Caribbean. And then those same ships again are going to bring sugar and molasses, which was a popular sweetener at that time that was cheaper to refine than sugar. It's going to be brought to the Caribbean and to North America or Britain to be used to make rum. And this entire cycle would continue. Okay, moving on to mass migration number 5. We will title this India to the British Empire. India to the British Empire. The British, who took control over South Asia, they transported tens of thousands of indentured workers from present-day India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka to East and South Africa, Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, and the Caribbean. When slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire in 1838, Indians became the cheap labor that the British would use to build railroads and work on sugar, coffee, and tea plantations throughout their empire. So today, people of Indian ancestry form substantial minorities in South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and until their forced migration from Uganda in that country as well. In Kenya today, there's 100,000 Kenyans of Indian descent. And in Fiji and Guyana, Hinduism, which is a religion native to India, it's the dominant religion in those places as well. This mass migration of Indian people from India to far-flung parts of the British Empire, it's sometimes called the Indian diaspora. Anytime you hear the word diaspora, for instance, the Jewish diaspora, it refers to a large movement of people from their home country to other countries in the world. To help you remember this mass migration, let me tell you an interesting story about the Indians in Fiji, which is a small island in the South Pacific, way off the coast of Australia, basically nowhere near India. In 2000, there was an election in Fiji, and the highest ranking official was not Fijian, but was of Indian descent, although his family had really been living in Fiji forever. The Fijian military staged a coup, which means they overthrew the government, and they ousted the man. They rewrote the Constitution to say, yes, we are a democratic society. Yes, everyone can vote. We can elect and we can appoint Hindus in all kinds of positions. But the Constitution was changed to say that the top position, the only ethnicity that the top position will be open to, is a Fijian. There's so many Indians in Fiji that there was a fear that they could take control of the country. And so to make sure that would never happen, the army changed the Constitution. In many other places we mentioned, the disproportionate share of wealth and the success enjoyed by people of Indian ancestry, it's become a source of ethnic conflict in those regions as well. Number 6, mass migration number 6, China to Southeast Asia. We'll call this China to Southeast Asia. People leaving China, emigrating from China, immigrating or migrating to different places in Southeast Asia. So the Chinese, they go into Manchuria, and Manchurians who are ethnically different, who are not Han Chinese, they see the Chinese as a foreign people who came into their land. The Chinese also came to the west coast of the United States and Canada to work on the railroads in the 1800s, and there's a huge Asian presence here ever since. But this is totally dwarfed by the Chinese in Southeast Asia. The Chinese go down into Indonesia, they go down into Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. And Singapore is the one you need to remember. What ethnicity are people from Singapore? They're not Singaporean. That is their nationality. Their nationality is Singaporean, but their ethnicity is Chinese. Singaporeans are Chinese. And how have the Chinese done in Singapore and other parts of the world? Very, very well. They have done so well that there is resentment against the Chinese in many parts of Southeast Asia. Malaysians, Indonesians, they resent the Chinese for just how well they've done. Let me tell you a story about the Bamboo Network to help you remember this particular migration. This is how it works in China. Chinese people, Chinese families, they go abroad as entrepreneurs. The idea is you go somewhere else, somewhere new, and you start a business, whatever the business might be, and eventually you will send money back to China from this business. Control of the business is generally passed on from generation to generation, and typically over time, a successful family will end up owning several businesses spread over a number of countries. This was a decision that was made by the government of China and the people of China a long, long time ago. We're talking maybe 1,000 years ago or so. And we call it today, we refer to this as the Bamboo Network. And here's what's interesting. They don't care if the business is successful or not. The family will support the business until it is. It may take one generation, it may take 2 generations, but their patience has paid off in Southeast Asia, creating resentment against ethnic Chinese. And all of you have seen this, you've all experienced this a little bit. In every little town in America, you're going to find a Chinese restaurant. In Riverside, Moreno Valley, you're going to find several Chinese restaurants. They may not be the busiest restaurants around, but they're hanging on. The Chinese are patient, they're entrepreneurial, and they have a history of going to other regions and creating business networks. In fact, the combined output of the 55 million Chinese that are overseas, in other words, of this Bamboo Network, equal to $600 billion, or close to the economy of a good-sized country. All right, mass migration number 7. We'll title this North Americans Across the Western United States. North Americans across the Western United States. And I can summarize this migration in 2 words. Manifest destiny. The idea that Northwestern Europeans, those original colonists, they're going to cross this vast continent that they perceive to be empty, though we know was actually inhabited by a rich and complex network of Native American tribes. This was something that was considered to be predetermined It was seen as destiny that Americans would control the continent from sea to shining sea, and that is what happened. Migration number 8, our last of the great modern migrations. We'll title this Western Russia across to Central Asia and Siberia. Again, Western Russia across Central Asia and Siberia. So Russia also experienced a major internal migration, but in Russia, people migrated east from the heartland of the Russian state near Moscow and St. Petersburg all the way to the shores of the Pacific. So beginning in the 1800s and all throughout the 1900s, Russian and then Soviet rulers tried to maintain control of the country's far eastern frontiers by encouraging people of Russian heritage to move out of Moscow and St. Petersburg and fill in the country. And by 1980, as many as 30 million Russians had moved out toward the borders. An easy way to remember migration number 8 is that it's really just the mirror image of migration number 7. Now, what's interesting is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, many of these people started moving back to their original homelands. I mean, imagine if the United States fell apart tomorrow and everyone in California saying, I guess you better go back to Massachusetts. I mean, I couldn't even imagine that happening. Of course, we've been here a lot longer, whereas the people of Russia, they still have memories of having left European Russia and going to Asian Russia. Nevertheless, despite many Russians moving back, the map will always, and for a long time at least, carry the impact of Russia's eastward expansion. So there you have it. 8 major migrations that have occurred over the past 5 centuries that have involved millions and millions of people like we've never seen before in history. If you can remember those, you're going to be pretty well off. I couldn't possibly know all the great migrations that have gone on in the history of the world, but those 8, those are the migrations that give you the big picture that can help explain so much